The winter of 1942 descended upon Stalingrad like a frozen hammer, turning the once thriving industrial city into a landscape of shattered concrete, twisted metal, and endless rubble. The Volga River, that great artery of Soviet Russia, flowed dark and cold beside the dying city, carrying with it the hopes and fears of an entire nation. In this hell on earth, where every building became a fortress and every street a killing ground, one young Soviet soldier would discover that survival often meant breaking the rules. His name was Anatoly Chekhov, a 23-year-old former hunter from the Ural Mountains who had arrived in Stalingrad in September with the 308th Rifle Division. Unlike many of his comrades who had been hastily trained and thrown into the meat grinder of urban combat, Anatoly possessed skills that set him apart. He had spent his youth tracking elk and bear through the dense forests of his homeland, learning patience, learning to read the land, learning to become invisible. These were the same skills that would keep him alive in the ruins of Stalingrad, where the average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier was measured not in weeks or days, but in hours. The battle for Stalingrad had been raging for months by the time Anatoly found himself assigned to a marksman unit defending a sector near the Red October factory. The Germans had pushed deep into the city, controlling roughly 80% of its ruins, and the remaining Soviet forces clung desperately to a narrow strip of land along the Volga's western bank. Here, in this compressed battlefield where opposing forces sometimes occupied different floors of the same building, the art of marksmanship became paramount. A skilled shooter could hold an entire block, could slow an advance, could tip the balance in a struggle where every meter mattered. Anatoly's unit was commanded by a gruff veteran named Lieutenant Volkov, a man who had survived the brutal opening months of Operation Barbarossa and carried the scars to prove it. Volkov was a by-the-book officer who believed in maintaining discipline even amid the chaos. He assigned positions to his marksmen according to standard tactical doctrine, placing them in fortified basements, behind reinforced walls, in locations that offered both good fields of fire and reasonable protection. This was the Soviet way, the proven way, the way that had been drilled into every officer during their training. But Anatoly saw things differently. During his first week in the sector, while moving through the ruins on a reconnaissance patrol, he discovered a peculiar structure that immediately caught his attention. It was the remains of what had once been a 4-story apartment building, now reduced to little more than a skeletal frame. Most of the structure had collapsed, leaving only a single corner standing precariously. And there, jutting up from the rubble, like a broken finger pointing at the sky, stood a chimney. The building around it had been destroyed, the floors had fallen away, but the chimney remained, a testament to the solid craftsmanship of its construction. To most observers, this chimney appeared to be nothing more than another piece of the city's shattered architecture, dangerous and unstable. The structure swayed slightly in the wind, and loose bricks occasionally tumbled from its heights, clattering down through the debris below. It looked like it could collapse at any moment, but Anatoly, drawing on his hunter's instinct, saw something else entirely. He saw a perch. The chimney stood approximately 15 meters high, rising above the surrounding rubble and offering an unobstructed view of a crucial intersection that the Germans had been using to move troops and supplies forward. More importantly, its very appearance of instability made it an unlikely position for a sniper. The Germans, masters of urban warfare themselves, had learned to watch for the obvious positions, the reinforced windows, the fortified corners, the places where a thinking soldier would naturally take cover. But who would climb a crumbling chimney that looked ready to fall? Who would risk their life on such an obviously dangerous perch? Anatoly would. The question was how to get there. The chimney was essentially a hollow brick tower, and its interior had partially collapsed, leaving a chaotic jumble of broken bricks and mortar inside. But enough of the structure remained that, With careful climbing, a person could potentially work their way to the top. Anatoly spent an entire night studying the approach, watching how the moonlight played across the rubble, noting which paths offered concealment from German observation posts. He memorized every handhold, every foothold, planning his route with the same care he had once used when stalking a particularly wary bear. On his third night in the sector, Anatoly decided to attempt the climb. He waited until the darkest hours before dawn, when exhaustion dulled the vigilance of enemy observers. He moved slowly, methodically, testing each brick before trusting it with his weight. The interior of the chimney was treacherous, with loose debris constantly threatening to shift beneath him. One wrong move, one careless placement of his hand, and he would tumble down into the rubble, probably breaking bones, certainly giving away his position to any Germans within earshot. It took him nearly 2 hours to reach the top, but when he finally pulled himself onto the narrow lip of bricks at the chimney's crown, Anatoly felt a surge of satisfaction. The view was extraordinary. From this height, he could see across a vast swath of the battlefield. The crucial intersection lay directly before him, approximately 200 meters distant. Beyond that, he could observe German positions that would have been invisible from ground level. He could see their communication trenches, their reinforcement routes, the paths they used when they thought they were safe from Soviet eyes. As dawn broke across the ruined city, painting the rubble in shades of gray and amber, Anatoly settled into his position. He had brought minimal equipment, his Mosin Nagant rifle, carefully maintained and zeroed, a canvas bag containing 20 rounds of ammunition, a water bottle, and a small piece of dark cloth that he draped over his head and shoulders to break up his silhouette. The narrow top of the chimney offered barely enough space for him to lie prone, but he made it work, wedging himself into position with practiced ease. The first German soldier appeared at the intersection just after sunrise. The man was moving with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself to be in a secure rear area, walking upright, rifle slung over his shoulder. Anatoly watched through his scope, his finger resting lightly beside the trigger guard. The range was well within his capability, the wind was calm, the target was moving predictably. But Anatoly held his fire. One shot would reveal his position, and he had learned that patience was often more valuable than marksmanship. Over the next hour, he observed the German pattern of movement. Small groups of soldiers crossed the intersection at irregular intervals, always moving from the same staging area to the same forward position. They were rotating troops, bringing fresh men to the front lines while pulling back the exhausted. It was a routine, predictable, and therefore vulnerable. But more importantly, Anatoly noticed something else. Around mid-morning, a larger group would cross, perhaps a dozen or more men, moving together. That would be his moment. When he finally climbed down from the chimney that first evening, exhausted but exhilarated, Anatoly made a crucial mistake. He reported his discovery to Lieutenant Volkov, describing the position and the opportunities it offered. He had expected his commander to recognize the value of the Chimney Perch, to praise his initiative, to encourage its use. Instead, Volkov's face darkened with anger. The lieutenant made his position clear in terms that allowed no argument. The chimney was unstable, dangerous, and violated every principle of defensive positioning. A sniper needed a secure position with multiple escape routes. The chimney offered neither. If it collapsed, the soldier would be lost. If he was spotted, he would be trapped with nowhere to retreat. If he was wounded, there would be no way to evacuate him. The position was reckless, foolish, and Anatoly was ordered to never use it again. Volkov assigned him instead to a reinforced position in a basement overlooking a secondary street, a location that was safe, secure, and utterly ineffective. For 2 weeks, Anatoly followed orders. He spent his days in the basement position, occasionally engaging targets of opportunity, but mostly watching and waiting. Meanwhile, The Germans continued to use the intersection freely, moving troops and supplies forward without significant interference. Other Soviet marksmen occasionally took shots at targets crossing the open ground, but firing from ground-level positions meant limited visibility and opportunity. The Germans learned quickly which areas were covered by Soviet fire and adjusted their movements accordingly. But Anatoly couldn't stop thinking about the chimney. At night, lying on his bedroll in the frozen basement that served as their quarters, he would calculate trajectories in his mind, remembering the perfect angles, the clear fields of fire, the tactical advantages that were being wasted. He understood Volkov's concerns, appreciated the logic behind standard tactical doctrine, but he also knew that conventional thinking rarely won unconventional battles, and Stalingrad was nothing if not unconventional. The turning point came on a bitterly cold morning in late November. German forces had been building up strength for a major push aimed at finally eliminating the Soviet foothold in the factory district. Intelligence reports suggested an attack was imminent, though the exact timing and location remained uncertain. The pressure on the Soviet defenders was immense, and every commander knew that even a small breakthrough could lead to catastrophic collapse. Resources were stretched impossibly thin, and every soldier, every position, every tactical advantage mattered more than ever. That morning, during a brief lull in the fighting, Anatoly approached Lieutenant Volkov again. He chose his words carefully, framing his request not as a challenge to authority, but as a tactical necessity. He pointed out that the Germans were using the intersection more frequently, suggesting it might be part of their preparation for the coming offensive. He noted that current Soviet positions offered limited coverage of that approach. He emphasized that observation alone, even without engaging targets, could provide valuable intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. Volkov was no fool. He understood the desperate nature of their situation, understood that desperate situations sometimes required unconventional solutions. After a long moment of consideration, studying the young marksman's determined face, the lieutenant made a decision. Anatoly could use the chimney position, but only for observation. He was explicitly forbidden from engaging targets unless given direct authorization. The lieutenant made it clear that this was a provisional arrangement, subject to immediate cancellation if it proved ineffective or if the risk became unacceptable. Anatoly agreed to the terms without hesitation, knowing that once he was in position, circumstances might provide the authorization he needed. That night, Anatoly made the climb again. It was somehow both familiar and terrifying, this ascent through the darkness, his rifle strapped across his back, his hands finding holds that he remembered from weeks before. The winter wind had strengthened, and the chimney swayed more noticeably now, creating an unsettling sensation of movement beneath him. But he persevered, and by the time the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, he was in position once more. The Germans appeared right on schedule, small groups crossing the intersection in the early morning hours. Anatoly watched and counted, noting numbers, equipment, the pace of movement. He observed officer insignia, identified unit markings, built up a picture of the enemy force facing them. Around mid-morning, just as he had seen weeks before, a larger group began to assemble in the staging area. But this time, something was different. The group was much larger than usual, at least 20 men, and they were clearly preparing for something more significant than a routine rotation. Through his scope, Anatoly could see officers conferring, could see soldiers checking weapons and equipment with the careful attention that soldiers give to such tasks before an assault. This wasn't a rotation. This was an attack force preparing to move, and their route would take them directly through the intersection, where they clearly believed they were safe from observation. Anatoly's mind raced. He needed to report this, but he had no radio, no way to communicate from his isolated perch. By the time he could climb down and deliver the warning, the Germans would have already moved into position. The element of surprise would be theirs. The carefully prepared defensive positions that Lieutenant Volkov had established would be struck without warning, without preparation. Soviet soldiers would face an attack they hadn't anticipated, and in the brutal mathematics of urban combat, that surprise could mean the difference between holding the line and catastrophic collapse. The decision crystallized in Anatoly's mind with sudden clarity. He had been given authorization to engage targets if circumstances warranted it. These circumstances more than warranted it. This wasn't about following orders or breaking them. This was about survival, about preventing an attack that could sweep through their entire sector. Sometimes a soldier had to trust his own judgment, had to accept responsibility for his own decisions. The German assault force began to move. They crossed the intersection in a tight formation, clearly confident in their security, moving quickly but not cautiously. They were professionals, well-trained, efficient, but they had made the fatal mistake of assuming they understood all the angles, had accounted for all the threats. They hadn't looked up. They hadn't considered the impossible perch. Anatoly's first shot took the officer leading the formation, the man dropping instantly as the bullet struck him in the chest. The sharp crack of the Mosin Nagant echoed across the ruins, and for a frozen moment, the German soldiers stood paralyzed, trying to process what had happened, trying to identify the source of the shot. They looked toward the known Soviet positions, toward the obvious places a sniper might be concealed. But Anatoly was already working the bolt, chambering a fresh round, settling his sights on his second target. The next shot dropped a soldier near the rear of the formation, and now panic began to set in. The Germans scattered, seeking cover, but the intersection offered little protection. It had been designed for vehicles, not infantry, and the rubble provided concealment but not cover from the height advantage Anatoly possessed. His third shot found a soldier attempting to crawl behind a pile of bricks. His fourth struck a man who had frozen in place, paralyzed by fear and confusion. The Germans began returning fire, but they were shooting blind, hosing bullets in the general direction they thought the shots might be coming from. Their rounds struck the rubble around Anatoly's chimney, but none came close to his position. From their angle, low to the ground and looking upward, the chimney was nearly impossible to spot against the chaotic background of the city's ruins. Anatoly had become a ghost, a phantom sniper delivering precision from an impossible angle. He continued to fire, methodically, carefully, making each shot count. The Germans were trying to retreat now, abandoning their assault plan, attempting to pull back to safety. But the intersection had become a killing ground, and retreat meant exposure. Anatoly's fifth shot, his sixth, his seventh. Each one carefully aimed, each one delivered with the calm precision of a master craftsman. This wasn't about anger or hatred. This was simply about necessity, about preventing an attack, about protecting his comrades. By the time the surviving Germans managed to pull back out of the intersection, 15 of their number lay motionless on the broken pavement. 15 soldiers who would never complete their assault, never threaten the Soviet positions. The attack had been broken before it could begin, shattered by a single marksman firing from a position that officially didn't exist. Anatoly remained in the chimney for another hour, watching, waiting to see if the Germans would attempt another crossing. But the intersection remained empty, and eventually he began the careful descent back to ground level. His hands were shaking slightly. Whether from adrenaline or the cold or the weight of what he had done, he couldn't say. He had fired 15 times and scored 15 hits, a performance that would have been remarkable under any circumstances, but which seemed almost impossible given the conditions. When he reported to Lieutenant Volkov's command post, Anatoly expected anger, expected punishment for violating the explicit orders he had been given. Instead, the lieutenant stood in silence for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Reports had already reached him from forward positions, reports of a German assault that had been broken, reports of an entire formation neutralized by accurate fire from an unknown position. The lieutenant had put the pieces together, had understood what had happened and why. Finally, Volkov spoke, and his words were measured, careful. He acknowledged that Anatoly had violated orders by engaging without authorization. He noted that this violation had prevented a potentially devastating attack, had saved Soviet lives, had maintained the integrity of their defensive line. He made it clear that discipline and following orders remained paramount in military operations. But he also, in his roundabout way, gave Anatoly implicit permission to continue using the chimney position. The young marksman had proven the value of unconventional thinking, had demonstrated that sometimes survival required breaking the rules. Over the following weeks, as the battle for Stalingrad ground through December and into January, the Chimney Perch became Anatoly's domain. He didn't use it every day, understanding that predictability was a sniper's enemy. Sometimes he would remain in the position only for observation, watching German movements, gathering intelligence. Other times, when opportunities presented themselves, when targets of sufficient value appeared, he would take careful shots, always conscious of the need to preserve his position's secrecy. The Germans never quite figured out where the shots were coming from. They knew the general area, understood that some Soviet marksmen had an elevated position with good coverage of the intersection. But despite their efforts to locate and neutralize the position, despite their own skilled snipers scanning the ruins, despite artillery barrages aimed at suspected positions, the chimney remained undiscovered. Its very improbability was its greatest protection. Who would think to look at a crumbling chimney that appeared ready to collapse at any moment? The physical toll of using the position was considerable. The climb itself was exhausting and dangerous, requiring nearly 2 hours each time. The chimney swayed noticeably in strong winds, creating a constant sense of vertigo. Temperatures in December sometimes dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, and exposure at that height, with minimal protection from the wind, tested even Anatoly's considerable endurance. He developed severe frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand, an injury that would trouble him for the rest of his life. But he continued to return to the position, continued to climb, continued to serve his purpose in the grinding machinery of the battle. Other members of his unit began to regard him with a mixture of admiration and wariness. Stories spread through the ranks about the sniper who used the impossible position, who climbed a crumbling chimney to rain precision down on the Germans. Some of the tales grew in the telling, as such stories always do. Some claimed he had scored 50 hits from the position. Others said 100. Some said the chimney was enchanted, protected by the spirit of the building's former residents. Such myths were common in Stalingrad, where the desperate circumstances of the battle seemed to generate their own folklore. The reality was less dramatic, but more impressive. By the time the battle for Stalingrad reached its conclusion in early February 1943, Anatoly had made approximately 30 successful engagements from the chimney position. The total number of Germans neutralized from that perch was never precisely calculated, but it likely exceeded 40. More importantly, his presence in that position forced the Germans to alter their movement patterns throughout his sector, slowing their operations, increasing their casualties, contributing to the gradual erosion of combat effectiveness that ultimately doomed the Sixth Army. The end of the battle brought its own challenges. When the last German units finally surrendered, when the shooting finally stopped and an eerie silence descended upon the frozen ruins, Anatoly made one final climb to his chimney perch. He sat there in the weak winter sunlight, looking out across the devastated city, trying to process what he had lived through, what he had done, what it all meant. The intersection below, which had seen so much violence, so much death, now stood empty and silent, just another patch of broken ground in a broken city. During the climb down, on that last descent, something happened that Anatoly had been half expecting for months. A section of the chimney wall, weakened by battle damage and winter freeze-thaw cycles, finally gave way beneath his hand. He felt the brick crumble, felt himself beginning to fall, and for a heart-stopping moment he thought this would be his end, survive the entire battle only to perish in its aftermath. But his other hand found purchase, his feet found a foothold, and he managed to arrest his fall. He made it to the ground, shaking but alive, and he never climbed that chimney again. The chimney itself stood for another 2 weeks before finally collapsing during a particularly strong wind. Anatoly was in a hospital by then, being treated for frostbite, exhaustion, and malnutrition, the usual afflictions of Stalingrad survivors. When he heard about the collapse, he felt an odd sense of loss, as if an old friend had passed away. That impossible perch had kept him alive, had given him purpose, had allowed him to make a difference in a battle where individual soldiers so often felt powerless against the vast machinery of war. The story of Anatoly and his chimney perch became one of countless tales of individual courage and ingenuity that emerged from Stalingrad. In the broader strategic narrative of the battle, his contribution was microscopic, a footnote to the monumental clash of armies that determined the course of the war. But in the tactical reality of urban combat, where every street, every building, every position mattered, his willingness to question conventional doctrine, to trust his own judgment, to use terrain in unexpected ways, made a genuine difference. Lieutenant Volkov survived the battle as well, though he never spoke publicly about having initially banned Anatoly from using the chimney position. In his official reports, he simply noted that one of his marksmen had demonstrated exceptional initiative and skill in utilizing unconventional firing positions. The implicit lesson was clear. Sometimes discipline meant knowing when to bend the rules, when to trust subordinates' judgment, when to prioritize results over regulations. The broader lessons from Stalingrad shaped Soviet military thinking for the remainder of the war and beyond. The battle demonstrated conclusively that urban warfare required flexibility, innovation, and a willingness to abandon conventional doctrine when circumstances demanded it. Sniper tactics in particular underwent significant evolution, with Soviet forces developing sophisticated training programs that emphasized adaptability and creative problem-solving alongside traditional marksmanship skills. Anatoly's story, when it was eventually documented, became part of the curriculum at Soviet sniper schools. But the emphasis was not primarily on his marksmanship, impressive as that was. Instead, instructors focused on his ability to read terrain, to identify opportunities that others had missed, to trust his hunter's instinct despite official disapproval. The message was clear. Technical skill with a rifle was necessary, but not sufficient. A truly effective marksman needed to think independently, to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles, to have the courage to act on those insights. The question of whether Anatoly was right to violate his orders on that crucial morning in November remained a subject of discussion in military academies for decades afterward. On one hand, military effectiveness depends fundamentally on discipline and adherence to orders. A soldier who picks and chooses which orders to follow undermines the entire command structure. On the other hand, combat is unpredictable and chaotic, and sometimes circumstances require immediate decisions that cannot wait for authorization from higher command. The officer giving orders cannot see everything, cannot anticipate every situation, must sometimes trust subordinates to make correct decisions independently. The Chimney Perch incident illustrated this tension perfectly. Had Anatoly climbed down to request permission to engage, the German assault force would have crossed unopposed, their attack would have proceeded, and the outcome might have been very different. By engaging without authorization, he prevented an attack and saved lives. But what if his judgment had been wrong? What if the targets he engaged had been a routine patrol rather than an assault force? What if his firing had revealed the position without achieving proportionate results? Military discipline exists precisely because individual judgment is fallible, because emotions and stress can cloud perception, because the needs of the larger operation must sometimes supersede individual initiative. There were no easy answers to these questions, which is perhaps why Anatoly's story remained valuable as a teaching tool. It forced students to grapple with the complexity of military decision-making, to understand that courage sometimes meant breaking rules, but that breaking rules always carried risks and consequences. The ideal soldier was neither a mindless automaton following orders regardless of circumstances, nor a lone wolf ignoring command structure in favor of personal judgment. The ideal was something more nuanced, a disciplined professional who understood doctrine, followed orders by default, but possessed the wisdom and courage to deviate from orders when circumstances genuinely warranted it. After recovering from his injuries, Anatoly was reassigned to a training unit, where he spent the remainder of the war teaching marksmanship and sniper tactics to new recruits. He proved to be a patient and effective instructor, able to communicate not just the technical aspects of shooting, but also the mental discipline required for effective sniping. He emphasized the importance of patience, of observation, of understanding the enemy's patterns and psychology. He taught his students to look for the unconventional positions, the angles that others might miss, the opportunities hidden within apparent obstacles. He also taught them about the weight of the work, about what it meant to observe another human being through a telescopic sight, to calculate wind and range, to squeeze a trigger and watch that human being fall. Sniping was not a video game, not an abstract exercise in ballistics. It was a profound responsibility that required mental strength and moral clarity. Some men could handle it, and some could not, and there was no shame in discovering that one belonged to the latter category. Anatoly himself had nightmares about the intersection, about the faces he had seen through his scope, about the moment when life became absence. He considered these nightmares the price he paid, a price that was both heavy and necessary. His students asked him about the chimney, of course. The story had spread throughout the Soviet military, growing and changing in the telling, acquiring mythical qualities. Anatoly always corrected the exaggerations, insisted on the mundane reality of cold and fear and exhaustion. But he also acknowledged the central truth that survival sometimes required unconventional thinking, that the obvious position was often a trap, that height advantage could be more valuable than solid cover. He encouraged his students to study their terrain carefully, to trust their instincts, to be willing to see possibilities that others might miss. The war ended, and Anatoly returned to the Ural Mountains, to the forests where he had learned to hunt, where the skills that saved his life in Stalingrad had first been developed. He never spoke much about his experiences to his family or neighbors. Like many veterans, he found that those who hadn't been there couldn't really understand, while those who had been there didn't need explanations. He took up hunting again, though he found that killing animals had become difficult for him in ways it never had been before Stalingrad. He had seen too much death, had been too close to death himself, had dealt death too efficiently. The forest that had once been simply home now felt like a sanctuary, a place of life and growth that stood in stark contrast to the dead city of his memories. He lived quietly for many years, working as a forester, raising a family, trying to build something positive from the wreckage of war. He received medals and commendations, but he kept them in a drawer, not from false modesty, but because they seemed to represent a person he no longer fully recognized. The young man who had climbed that chimney, who had made those impossible shots, who had shaped the course of battle in his own small way, felt like someone from another lifetime, someone he had once been, but was no longer. In his later years, military historians occasionally sought him out, wanting to document his experiences, to preserve his story for future generations. He agreed to some interviews, though he always downplayed his own role, always emphasized the contributions of his comrades, the men who had fought beside him, the officers who had trusted him, the soldiers who had held other positions while he occupied his famous perch. He insisted that victory in Stalingrad was the result of millions of individual acts of courage and endurance, not any single person's heroics. When asked about the decision to engage without authorization, about whether he regretted violating orders, Anatoly's answer was characteristically thoughtful. He said that he had done what seemed necessary at the time, based on the information he had and the circumstances he faced. He acknowledged that he might have been wrong, that his judgment might have been flawed, that he had been lucky as much as skilled. But he also noted that war didn't allow for perfect decisions, only for honest efforts to make the best choice possible, given imperfect information and terrible pressure. He had made his choice, had accepted responsibility for it, and had lived with the consequences. That was all any soldier could do. The tactical principles that Anatoly's experience demonstrated continued to influence military thinking long after Stalingrad faded into history. The importance of height advantage, the value of unconventional positions, the need for adaptability in urban combat, these lessons were incorporated into doctrine and training programs across multiple nations and conflicts: Vietnam, Beirut, Grozny, Fallujah. Each urban battle saw soldiers applying variants of the same principles that Anatoly had discovered in that frozen Russian city decades earlier. The chimney itself, or rather the memory of it, became a kind of symbol in military culture, representing the idea that effectiveness sometimes requires looking beyond the obvious, questioning conventional wisdom, trusting one's own judgment despite official disapproval. Young officers studying military history would hear about the forbidden perch that proved its worth, about the lieutenant who ultimately supported his subordinate's initiative, about the intersection where 15 Germans fell to a sniper they never saw. The story became shorthand for a particular type of military virtue, the courage to question, combined with the skill to deliver results. But perhaps the most important lesson from Anatoly's story was something less tactical and more human. It was the recognition that individual initiative mattered, that even in the vast machinery of modern war, one person making one decision could influence outcomes. This wasn't about hero worship or the myth of the lone warrior. It was about the aggregate effect of thousands of individual soldiers, each facing their own decisions, each contributing their own small piece to the larger mosaic of battle. Anatoly's Chimney Perch was remarkable, but it was remarkable precisely because it represented what countless other soldiers were also doing in their own ways, solving problems, adapting to circumstances, finding paths forward despite obstacles and opposition. The Battle of Stalingrad claimed over 2 million lives, military and civilian, making it one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The city was almost completely destroyed, reduced to rubble that took decades to clear and rebuild. The strategic consequences of the battle were immense, marking the beginning of Germany's long retreat from the Soviet Union, the turning point where Nazi expansion was finally halted and reversed. In such a massive conflagration, any individual contribution might seem insignificant, a drop in an ocean of violence and suffering. But those drops mattered. Each soldier who held their position mattered. Each officer who made sound decisions mattered. Each marksman who took careful shots mattered. The cumulative effect of all these individual efforts was what determined outcomes, what saved or lost battles, what protected or failed to protect the people, depending on military success. Anatoly's 15 shots from his impossible perch were 15 drops in that ocean. But they were his drops, his contribution to the effort, his way of making a difference in circumstances that seemed designed to render individual effort meaningless. The chimney that had been his domain, that had sheltered him and endangered him in equal measure, was gone, buried somewhere beneath the rubble, eventually covered over as Stalingrad was rebuilt into Volgograd. But the memory of what happened there persisted, passed down through military history, through teaching programs, through the oral tradition of soldiers telling stories to other soldiers. It persisted because it contained something essential about the nature of warfare, about initiative and discipline, about courage and judgment, about the lonely responsibility of making decisions when there's no time to ask permission and no guarantee of being right. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Anatoly's story wasn't the marksmanship or the unconventional position or even the decision to engage without authorization. The most remarkable thing was that he survived to tell the story at all. Stalingrad was a charnel house that consumed soldiers by the thousands, where survival was often more a matter of luck than skill, where death could come from a random shell, or a sniper's bullet, or hypothermia, or any of 100 other causes. That Anatoly lived through the battle, that he was able to return home, to heal, to build a life, to eventually share his experiences with historians and students, that itself was extraordinary. His story reminds us that behind the statistics, behind the strategic analyses, behind the tactical doctrines and after-action reports, war is ultimately about individual human beings making impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure. Some of those decisions work out, some don't. Some are remembered and studied, most are forgotten. But each one matters to the person making it, matters to the people depending on them, matters in the moment when the decision is made and its consequences unfold. The intersection in Stalingrad, where 15 German soldiers fell to fire from an impossible angle, was eventually rebuilt, paved over, returned to civilian use. People walk across it today without knowing what happened there, without understanding the violence and fear and desperate courage that once marked that ground. This is as it should be. Cities are meant for the living, for commerce and community, not as perpetual monuments to the dead. But the story of what happened there, of Anatoly and his chimney perch, of Lieutenant Volkov's decision to trust his subordinate's judgment, of the German soldiers who never saw where death was coming from, that story remains valuable precisely because it's so specific, so human, so full of difficult questions that have no perfect answers. We remember Stalingrad for many reasons. We remember the strategic pivot it represented, the enormous casualties it inflicted, the brutal conditions under which the battle was fought. We remember the heroism and the horror, the sacrifice and the suffering. But we should also remember the smaller stories, the individual decisions, the moments when one person's choice made a difference. These stories remind us that war, for all its mass and scale and industrial horror, still comes down to individuals, to the choices they make, to the courage they find or fail to find, to the wisdom they exercise or fail to exercise in moments of extreme pressure. Anatoly Chekhov's 15 shots from a forbidden perch in Stalingrad were just one small moment in one battle in one war, but they were his moment, and they mattered to him and to the men who lived because those 15 Germans didn't complete their assault. And in being remembered, in being studied, in being passed down as a story worth telling, they continue to matter, continue to teach, continue to remind us that individual initiative and courage and judgment still have value even in the most massive and impersonal of conflicts. That is worth remembering. That is worth teaching. That is why the story of the forbidden chimney perch endures.